Hi, honey. Welcome home. She was down in the basement, out in the yard with the kids, up in one of the bedrooms, or in the kitchen. When I walked in the door of that house, hi, honey. Welcome home. Oh, how I hated it. Who would want to welcome me home? I mean, look, it was awful. Then I got a break. The Volstead Act came along. I said, thank God. Now by public writ, I can't drink anymore. By public writ. And lo and behold, somebody informs me that physicians will have access to grain alcohol. And if you knew the number of fraudulent prescriptions that I wrote for dead or imaginary patients over the years, which set up a whole new panoply of anxiety, the fear of exposure, disclosure, defamation, ruination, because I was literally breaking federal and state law just to get my hands on booze. I even tried a beer cure. Didn't like this stuff, but I became a home brewer. This was allowed during Prohibition. I brewed gallons of the stuff. The net result? Gas. Gas of the worst kind. I mean, got to the point where my associates, especially the nurses, used to refer to me as Herr Dr. Belchenfarts. I mean, I finally gave up the beer before the good news wafted down on my patients, It was just horrible. It was just a horrible time in my life. How I maintained this. Today I look back and it was just extraordinary. We're gifted, we alcoholics, to survival. But it was extraordinary. But I maintained it. Finally, 1929, I decided that the best way to solve my problem was to become a surgeon. The depression had just hit. The crash had just hit. I had a modest inheritance, and I decided that I'll become a surgeon for very practical reasons. Number one, a good surgeon made in one operation what took me a whole week to earn. Number two, I could meet my patients in the afternoon, late in the afternoon, when my hands had stopped shaking through the use of prescription medicine that I was taking. I could do my operations at night, and the hospitals loved it because the theaters most often as much were closed at night, and I was going to operate at night when my hands weren't shaking anymore. So I said, that's it, I'll become a physician. I went to Philadelphia, set up at Jefferson, and through the hardest of another nightmare, that's all I can call it, I finally was board certified as a surgeon. Came back to Akron, and a position opened up in the Akron Hospital for a proctologist, rectal surgeon. And I took that, because it was a position back in the hospital. My colleagues like to say that I took the job because my patients wouldn't be able to see my hands shake, unless they had eyes in the back of their head. And it was awful. But anyway, I became a surgeon. And I think today, had I not drank, I would have been pretty good. I think I could have developed a couple of procedures. But next thing happens, again the rat race began. I began to drink again, missed appointments. Oh, thank God I don't think I ever botched an operation. And I pray that I never caused harm, but it was awful. Little realizing that my salvation was at hand, not close at hand, but it was in the beginning. A movement had sprung up in this country called the First Century Christian Fellowship, begun by a fellow by the name of Frank Buchman. Frank B., they called him. He was from Allentown, a Lutheran minister, who had had a spiritual conversion after an altercation with some people that he was working for in Allentown at the YMCA. Had gotten very upset over some, still to me is a very clouded issue, but he wrote all of them very, very vitriolic, nasty letters, and I don't know how you can curse somebody out in a spiritual sense, but he did it. But he left, he fled then, and he went to Europe, and it was in England where he went to a convention, a sort of a prayer meeting, outdoor prayer meeting, largely. But anyway, he had a spiritual conversion experience of such magnitude that he was able to sit down after he went through the process of realizing what he had done wrong, recognizing the wrong that he had done, and he wrote to each one of the board members of the Y back in Allentown, and he begged their forgiveness, which was for him a very heroic act. And when he had gotten through this, he began to realize that he could incorporate what had occurred with him and give it to other people to encourage similar conversion experiences in their life. Very Christ-centered, very biblical. You were enjoined to read Scripture. If you belong to a church, be active in the church. If you didn't, join a church. Pray and meditate. Help each other out. Meditate was extremely, reflection was a very, very important part of the process of their own recoveries. And to share these reflections with other people, to be guided in the right direction, to talk things out, to share, much like we do today, share at meetings. They would converse with each other. And it became popular for a while in this country, and then it became a scourge in this country, because one example I like to remember is at Princeton, which at that time wasn't a major university, it was just a religious school, and here you had even the top officials of them admitting openly to transgressions and sins and all types of fornications and whatever it was horrible, that the people, the trustees, drove him out of town. I mean, they literally, if they could, they would have ridden him out of town on a rail. And he went to Europe and finally wound up in England at the university at Oxford. And England was going through a tremendous inward searching as a result of the World War, where they had lost so many young men. It was a terrible time for them, and here was somebody that gave them sort of a spiritual path, somewhere they could restore just their sensibilities, their spirituality, and it became very, very popular. So popular that they then came back over the Atlantic as the Oxford Group. The only reason they called themselves the Oxford Group because First Century Christian Fellowship was too much writing for a baggage ticket for the baggage handlers of the train station, so they just wrote Oxford Group. That's how they got the name. Anyway, the Oxford Group became successful in this country to the point that at a meeting in Colorado, they sobered up one of the heirs of the Firestone fortune here in Akron. And the father of the son was so pleased with what had happened to his son and so grateful that he encouraged an Oxford Group team to come to Akron to put on a gathering. And Bob's wife, Ann, and a good friend of theirs, Henrietta Seiberling, encouraged Bob to come with him. Now Bob, me, I wanted no part of it. No part of it at all. But out of respect for these two women, I decided that I would look into it. And immediately I was taken with the positiveness of these people. Very direct, very upbeat, and I mean, they use a lot of cliches perhaps, but they generated a lot of positive energy, and I needed that. I was in a malaise. I was caught up in my addiction and really terrified, full of anxieties, and of course no relationship with a higher power at all. But I finally began to agree to some of their tenets, their ideas, and with very little argument. And there was a simple process for them, and all they suggested to us was that we take a good look at our lives, examine ourselves, and then share it with another person or persons, if we needed to, in confidence, of course. Make as much amends as possible for the harms done. Try and help by example and by expression to help other people. And finally, create a relationship through prayer and reflection with a higher power, God. Christ-centered for them, but for me it was still very nebulous. I was gray in that area. But they told me to read the scriptures every night, and I began to do that. They told us to join a church, and Ann and I joined a church, and we did that. And for the next 2 years, I was an active, drunken member of the Oxford Group. I couldn't draw a sober breath. What am I doing wrong? I mean, it just dismayed me. I was one of those want to guys. I want to be a part of it, but I didn't want to be a part of it because there was one tenet that I couldn't adopt, and that was helping others. Earlier in my life, I had developed an attitude where I didn't care for the rights, the wishes, or the privileges of other people. I wouldn't do them any harm, but I wouldn't go out of my way to do them any good. That was my attitude. It's very pervasive, and I've had a hard time overcoming that, but that was my attitude. But in order to be effective in this program, this OG setup, one of the things we had to do is we had to carry the message to other people. We had to express or conversion to other people. For me to do that meant that I would have to acknowledge the fact that I had